Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I'm going to be talking about my favourite authors and my journeys with reading them. This topic was picked for me by Emily of Novel Novels. It's simply because I was struggling to come up with anything to record for Vlogmas. To anyone who's followed my channel for any length of time, you're going to know who my favourite writers are. And this year I've talked about one a lot more than any other time, so I am going to start with the most obvious one, and that is Joanne Harris. I first discovered Joanne Harris in 2007 with the book Rune Marks. This is a book set 500 years after the end of Ragnarok and follows the character of Maddie, who I believe the old gods never disappeared, and there is something of the talk of a reoccurrence of war. I will admit it has been a very long time since I read this book. There's also a sequel called Rune Light that I have never read but is on my shelf up there, and I've simply avoided because I despise the cover wholeheartedly. And then you have companion books called The Gospel of Loki and the something else of the Testament of Loki, and I believe there is going to be another book soonish. When I first saw the cover of this book and I read the first line all those years ago, I immediately asked for this book for Christmas. My parents got it for me. They also got me the Lollipop Shoes. You will have heard me talk about this book a lot because this is the book that really inspired my adoration of Joanne Harris as a writer. At the time, I did not know that this was a sequel to Chocolat, and that didn't matter, because I believe every single one of the Vian Roche books can be read separately. Reading them as a whole is great, and you can see connections between the different books. And recently with The Strawberry Thief last year, that is a book that does have mention of characters you've met in the Lollipop Shoes, but just because we've known them as readers doesn't mean that you have to have known them to read the book yourself. So what I got to see here was a taste of everyday magic. It was somewhat like practical magic for me, in that you didn't really know whether it was magic or not. There was talk of cantrips and that sort of thing, and it was a way I hadn't seen magic done before, as though Vian Roche was just cooking chocolate and it could tell people their future or their past. Vian could read the chocolate as people would read tea leaves, and the first line of this got me, which was, "It is a relatively little known fact that over the course of a single year, about 20 million letters are delivered to the dead." I remember reading that first line when there was a queue for the toilet at home, and so I just picked up the nearest book to me and sat reading it as soon as I'd woken up in the morning. And then I read this book, I binge read it. I reread it so many times that first year. I wrote a piece of fan fiction for it when that option came up during my A-levels. I wrote a letter to Joanne Harris. No, I wrote a message to Joanne Harris on MySpace. I don't even know if it was the writer at the time, just to talk about my adoration of the book. And then, yeah, so from here, I began to collect all of Joanne Harris's works that I could find at the charity shop. There was something about the way the writer writes that I always find particularly inspiring. There is something in the dashes and the way that she uses grammar. There is a floweriness to her prose that I never found pretentious or I ever found too difficult to get into. There is a pace there and there's a poetry, and the writer can turn her hand to anything. I mentioned it in a previous video that she has done thrillers. Now, I will admit I haven't read them, Gentlemen and Players, and there is a name for that entire series, which I believe, as with the Chocolat Vian Roche books, are companions, but when read together provide a overall narrative. I believe the very first book Joanne Harris released was a vampire novel called The Evil Seed. Once again, my knowledge of her as a writer is somewhat limited because I haven't read everything they've ever written. After the Lollipop Shoes, I got gifted Blackberry Wine for Christmas and 5/4 of the Orange, because back then there was the food trilogy, which was Chocolat, 5/4 of the Orange and Blackberry Wine, and Vian Roche hadn't yet become the bigger series, which had the 4 separate books. And I know I read 3/4 of the Orange, but I can't remember reading Blackberry Wine. I no longer own that book because when I was unhauling books years ago, having accumulated more than 300 unread books from the charity shop, borrowing them, I mentioned it in a video last week, I just started taking back the books that I'd borrowed from the shop and never paid for, and a lot of my Joanne Harris books were in that. And you might think, Charlie, why don't you just pay for them? And for whatever reason at the time, I was thinking I can just go to the library and get them. But as an author brings out more recent works, I'm the type of reader that doesn't seem to go back. And so I know that I read 3/4 of the Orange, and Coastliners is a book that always sticks in my head because I started at uni and I hadn't yet made any friends or acquaintances. I knew where the library was. And throughout high school, I had been the person that went and just spent all of my time in the library. I was very much the social outcast, and I did that to myself. I did this at uni as well, and I'd have one class in the morning and then a very long break. And I hadn't discovered that the rest of this class were actually going off and having lunch together, dining together and chatting. So I'd just go off to the library, and I remember days spent incredibly hungry and cold inside the library at uni because I still hadn't yet booked up the courage to eat in front of people I didn't know. And I just sat there for hours at a time reading Coastliners. But as I say, there is just something about the way that the writer skips around genres that I find really inspiring. And it also means that I have a confidence in the writer then that I can pick up any of their books, and whilst they're not all going to be favourite books, I know that I can pick up one of them, I'm going to enjoy it, and I know what to expect from that writer, as with any of these books. And I like that. I like the fact that the writer does skip around genres so much, because it means that, say I am feeling like reading a psychological thriller, I can just think, well, Joanne Harris wrote one. We know that we like the writer's prose, so we can go and get it. And I do plan on doing that with Gentlemen and Players. There's just so much experimentation there, and such creativity that I often find myself inspired. And some of my favourite books have come from this writer, and I really wish that one day I will be able to hop around as many genres as she has done and do it without really thinking I need to be doing this for the reader. I like the Anne Rocher books first started coming out about 20 years ago now, and there are 4. And so we've had Chocolat, we had the Lollipop Shoes, which was 7 years later. 6 years after that, we got Peaches for Monsieur le Curé. And then last year, which was another 6 years after that, we got The Strawberry Thief. Yet nobody has been pushing for those books. I mean, people have wanted more books featuring Anne Rocher, but the writer has always stuck to her guns and always stuck to just releasing the books that she wants to and writing the books that she wants to, you know, regardless of the genre or what people are coming to expect. And I really like that in a writer. And it irks me so much that people just think Joanne Harris and they think Chocolat and they just think contemporary women's fiction. I hate it as a term. I hate how certain books get categorised, and I find it irksome. And yeah, but also the side project as Joanne M Harris, where she's releasing the fantasy novels, fantastic. If you haven't read The Blue Salt Road and I can't remember the title of the first one because I don't own it, which is sad all the time. They are rewritten folk tales, and they are brilliant. And nearly 1/4 of an hour spent talking about Joanne Harris. When I edit it down, I know it won't be, but just know that above any of these, it's the most obvious. She is definitely currently my favourite writer, and I don't care what that says about me as a reader. Next, we're going to move on to another obvious writer, and that is Charles Dickens. Every year since 2006, I have reread A Christmas Carol. But I need to go back further than that to 10-year-old Charlie. No, even earlier than that. 8-year-old Charlie. I had just inherited this entire read Dickens collection from my grandparents. I say that, they just kept offloading books onto me. They hadn't died, they just gave them to me. In year 4, we got asked the question as to who our favourite author was. At the time, the only books I owned were by J.K. Rowling and Jacqueline Wilson. And I wasn't prepared to say that because there was something within me that was a bit of a snob. And so I said Charles Dickens. And I remember another child in the class said you only said that because he shares the same name as you. And we got into an argument. Because she was right, but I wasn't about to admit that. I was trying to save face. I kept remembering that. And then 2 years later, we'd done all our exams in year 6 and we got told we could bring in video games and videos. And guess what? I had none of them. Again, to talk about history, I said I'd have to mention being poor. Did not have a lot of money. Didn't have video games. Didn't have handheld consoles. I'd had to borrow my cousins to go away with when they'd done a residential trip and said to bring them along. I thought it was like mandatory. It wasn't. I took Oliver Twist in. I sat there for an entire day trying to read Oliver Twist. I've just remembered it wasn't exam time, it was Christmas time. And I sat there, because they'd said we could bring books, trying to get through Oliver Twist. I made a mistake, and 18 years later, we don't talk about that mistake, but I know that I tried to read Oliver Twist, and maybe that's why I've never gone back to it, because of the embarrassment I still feel. But that is the reason I've never read Oliver Twist, is because I hate the film. I despise the musical Oliver vehemently. Every single adaptation of Oliver Twist I've ever seen, I have ended up feeling good. He deserves it. I hate that boy. So I've never read it. 6 years down the line, however, I did read A Christmas Carol. I didn't read this copy first. I used to own a very small, very cheap copy. But I gained a great adoration of Robert Ingpen's illustrations. I read this, and as soon as I read this, like, well, there you go, you've read Dickens now, you can call him a favourite writer. Leave it a few years, and I start going to Bakewell with my dad. And Bakewell is where he goes. It's a sheep market. He always said that me and my mum should go, and we could go and walk around the town for a day. So the first time we went, I went into the bookshop there, and I found the very cheap Wordsworth classics at £2 a pop. And so I bought every single Dickens book they had on their shelves. And then I was sat in a cafe just laughing at Martin Chuzzlewit. And then I think I'd left it a few years, but I decided I really needed to break in to get him to read these Dickens books. So the first one I pulled off my shelf at the time was Nicholas Nickleby. It took me 2 years to read Nicholas Nickleby. I probably read it as people would have read it back in the 1800s. And I ended up thoroughly adoring that book. I started reading that whenever they did the most recent... No, it wasn't the most recent. There was a modern day adaptation of Nicholas Nickleby anyway, and I chose to read that one then, and it took me 2 years. I found it great. I don't know whether Dickens wrote the line, "The beauty of the earth is but a breath and man is but a shadow," but I remember that line. I adore that quote. From there, I then don't think I read Dickens again until I started on YouTube with the Pickwick Papers, moved into the old curiosity shop. I have now then I did Our Mutual Friend. I've done Dombey and Son, I've done Martin Chuzzlewit, and most recently I did an annotation of David Copperfield, and in the new year I think it's definitely going to be Bleak House. Oliver Twist and Barnaby Rudge are being saved right at the end for me to be a Dickens completionist. I have The Life of the Lord planned to read this month alongside A Christmas Carol, and I just find magic in his prose, really. I don't know how to explain it other than his wordy, grandiloquent phrasing I find magnificent. I really appreciate Dickens as a storyteller. I still think that my favourite is A Christmas Carol. I enjoy the links back to folklore with this one and the ghosts and what Dickens is saying. But he does repeat themes a lot. But there's something about his language that I thoroughly adore. Currently, I'd say I preferred the books that are from earlier in his career, if I was to rank the ones that I've read. Admittedly, Dickens I thought was Michael Caine for a while because of A Muppet's Christmas Carol, which makes no sense because Gonzo was Dickens in that, but hey. Child Charlie thought a lot of weird things, and he thought that Michael Caine was Charles Dickens and that Charles Dickens was still alive and well for many years, much more years than adult Charlie would care to admit. I don't always like Dickens' treatment of women in his books. Oftentimes I find the endings can be rushed and really don't make sense, but the overall prose and the style, I'm quite fond of it. So that's Charles Dickens. I'm moving on now because I've realised I actually do have more authors to talk about. The next being Joanna Cannon. Now, Joanna Cannon only has 3 books: The Trouble with Goats and Sheep, 3 Things About Elsie, and Breaking and Mending, which is her non-fiction book about working in the NHS. But a few years ago, during the period of unfathomable sadness, I discovered Joanna Cannon, and I saw the title of this book, read the back, set in the 1976 summer heatwave, and I knew I had to own it. Even though Joanna Cannon has only written 2 fiction books and 1 non-fiction book, I know that whatever she releases in future, I will read and I will adore. Her prose reminds me of Alan Bennett. There is a nostalgic quality there. It's the Alan Bennett quality that does it for me. I adore Talking Heads by Alan Bennett. We know it inspired me a lot. The Trouble with Goats and Sheep, when I first read this book, is a book that I wish I had been able to write. There is humour and pathos here, and I feel like in future, it's one of my regrets about releasing Our Doris when I did. I think that that was the best book I could have written at the time, and I think that it's incredibly focused on hitting every punchline and making so many jokes, and I do think it's probably my most humorous book, but I feel like if I'd left it, I could have written a book similar to The Trouble with Goats and Sheep, where the humour is beneath the surface. There's a very big focus on characters and examining characters, and Joanna Cannon does that brilliantly. She examines the characters, but she shows us people we know in order that we can explore the stories as not just ourselves, the reader, but through knowing the characters within there, we're able to explore the overall story. The avenue in here reminds me of so many streets and the way people communicate on those streets, the nosiness of neighbours and the inquisitiveness of children. And council estates, like everyone says that you wouldn't get children roaming around as you did in 1976, like people would always have their doors open and children would be raised by the community. On a council estate, that is exactly what happens. When I was a child, it happened. I didn't much partake in disappearing into neighbours' houses, but I know that on my street in particular, just focusing on this, every child was in every single neighbour's house all of the time playing with each other. I still remember a snowball fight from Christmas Day once where me and my brother and then 2 children from another house just went outside and were having this snowball fight for about 3 hours. And these things just happened naturally, and Joanna Cannon captures that feeling of community and interconnectivity really well. She examines everything under a microscope while still managing to maintain the storytelling skill that I've only ever felt akin to Alan Bennett, because it's a classic storytelling skill that we all have in the North. We're constantly telling stories in the North. I don't know about the South, but any family that has strong older relatives, there is a tendency to tell stories, and our lives are really built on the stories of our ancestors. I can tell stories dating back 150 years now because of what I've been told by my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and my great-grandmother's sisters throughout my life. And Joanna Cannon captures that sense of storytelling really well in her prose, and I adore it wholeheartedly and will support anything this writer does in future. Because she's blooming marvellous. And yes, I did say that this book was my favourite of the last 5 years, and I still agree with that sentiment. I should also point out that earlier this year, my sister said she was in the mood to read, and so I just pulled off some of my favourite books and gave her 3 Things About Elsie, and she read that really quickly, and it became a favourite book of hers as well. So, you know, sometimes me and my sister have similar likes and interests, and in this case, we've managed to find it in Joanna Cannon. Next, I'm moving on to Sebastian De Castel, and here I'm holding up Traitor's Blade, which is the first book in the Greatcoat series. I was introduced to Sebastian De Castel by Sam over at Sam's Nonsense back in the day, and she read these books extremely quickly. So her adoration inspired me to buy this book. I read this book in one sitting. It's that compulsive. Now, I'm not saying that De Castel is the most brilliant at craft, but in giving the reader a compulsive narrative that hits all of those sorts of magic, swords and sorcery type fantasy television shows of the past, he hit the nail on the head with this one. Apparently it was somewhat inspired by the Three Musketeers, and basically the Greatcoats used to protect the king. They rebelled against the king and killed him, and now are disgraced. And this follows a band of, was it 4 of them? Or just 3? I think it was just the 3 of them. And so here, they ended up getting framed for murder, and then it followed their journey throughout. They end up stuck inside the city and protecting a young girl there, which then led into a huge narrative that spread over the next 3 books. Once I read this, I ended up going on Amazon Prime. I know, shameful, and doing next day delivery for Knight's Shadow and what is it called? Knight's Shadow, Saint's Blood, and I had to wait for Tyrant's Throne. So I read this. Knight's Shadow arrived the next day. I read that in one sitting. The next day I read Saint's Blood, got through all of that, and I had to wait a few weeks for Tyrant's Throne. But yes, there are coincidences. There are twists where villains will appear out of nowhere just to end a conversation. The dialogue is snappy and what you'd expect from a TV show, and it isn't the most brilliant writing in the world, but it's full of humour, it's full of heart, the characters are brilliant, you feel such closeness and empathy and sympathy with the characters. And that's just the Greatcoat series. Then we move on to the Spellslinger series, where De Castel's writing has improved. And this is a YA series in which Callan is a non-magical person in a magical tribe, and he ends up going on this kind of quest for self-discovery throughout the entirety of the series. I'd say the reason I think that he's improved with his writing is that when in these books, rather than zipping all over the place like the Greatcoat series did, he focuses on one area and one story, and he covers the entirety of the world over a period of books. And I know that it's going to culminate really brilliantly in Crownbreaker, which is on my list to read this month. I'll keep mentioning the books I'm planning on reading because they're stuck in my head. I will read anything Sebastian De Castel puts out because I now feel like faithful to him, because he's proven to me that he's able to write really action-packed, thrilling stories that have humour and pathos, do everything they're supposed to do, and they're easy reading. And I'm all about that easy reading sometimes. And sometimes you just want to be able to pick up a book and know that, yeah, I'm going to like it. Which brings me on to Robin Hobb, which was also inspired by Sam of Sam's Nonsense. Here we have Ship of Magic, which is the first book in the Live Ship Traders trilogy, which is my favourite fantasy series of all time. This series here follows Althea Vestrit, who was set to inherit her father's live ship, ships that come to life. Only he has given it to his son-in-law instead upon his death, and this sets off a chain of events that is bloody awful to read about, but is honestly a fantastic book with a character arc that I never saw for the character of Malta Vestrit, who went from my least favourite character in fiction to my most favourite character in fiction. It has matriarchy and strong female roles at its core, and piracy, dragons, and it is absolutely blooming brilliant. Robin Hobb, as opposed to Sebastian De Castel, is more literary. This doesn't sit well with some people. Some of her books can be a bit weighty and long, and there does need to be some cutting back. But there is something about the way she writes characters that really is inspiring and brilliant and fantastic and fills me with all of the awe. I have now read the entirety of the Realm of the Elderling series, which begins with the... what's it called? So we have the Farseer trilogy, then we have this, then we have the Tawnyman trilogy, then we have the Rainwell Chronicles, and then we have the Fitz and the Fool series. Robin Hobb has also written several other books that I haven't yet to read, but I intend to in future. I always talk about Fool's Fate. Fool's Fate by Robin Hobb was the first time I ended up crying at a book in years since my childhood, because the characters within the Farseer books had become like family to me. And in particular, there is a relationship that Fitz has with another character that in Fool's Fate broke my heart a little bit. I won't lie to you. I just remember being sat there reading it beside my father and then being like, I can't read this in the living room. My eyes were watering, and I was saying it was just that I must have been reading too much. And then when I went to my room and I was reading it, I was like, oh, this is what emotions are, because it'd been so long since I'd felt them that I was quite surprised. My eyes were watering and everything. I just hoped that I was allergic to something, and it turns out, yes, I am allergic to sadness. There's a literary quality to all of Robin Hobb's prose that really melds well with the fantasy that she's telling. And I don't much go in for the fantasy stories that are all set in forests and woodland and are very like classically white and westernized. I like something different. And Robin Hobb always manages to find that twist and has crafted an entire world incredibly brilliantly here, and doesn't mind torturing her characters, even if it's not what the reader wants, it's what the story needs. And I like that. And I like a writer who isn't afraid to show the truths of war and relationships and royalty. I'm always grateful to Sam of Silence Nonsense of introducing me to these books, because Robin Hobb is someone I will revisit in future and have to go through every single emotional roller coaster all over again. Next, I want to talk about Neil Gaiman. I think Stardust was released in 2005, the film, which is why I have this really beautiful movie cover. I watched the film, I adored the film. The film is still one of my favourites. I see the film and the book as two completely separate entities because they are so very different. I go to the film for one thing and I come to Stardust for another. Some people don't really like this book. And that just makes me like it more. I see all of the links to fairy tales when here. It is like an adult fairy tale. This guy called Tristan fancies a girl. She tells him to catch a star. He catches the star for her. But then, you know, a bit of a classic love story there. There's also, again, another royal conspiracy here. There's witches again. Neil Gaiman does, in this book, what he always does, which is takes the fantasy tropes and he twists them a little bit and he makes them humorous. What I'd say, again, with Neil Gaiman is that we have another classic British storyteller who's able to bring humour to his prose. And my parents also bought me Neverwhere, and then every year I just ask for another Neil Gaiman book or I buy them myself. I think most of the books have been urban fantasy, and that was something that I really got into in my teenage years. I do really like Neil Gaiman's storytelling skills, and how if you look closer you can see links to different things and you can see what has inspired the writer most. His prose can beg a reread, really. I remember when I read this book as part of I just really felt like reading this book a few years ago over the Christmas period because I felt like it really suited it, and then I ended up going straight back in because I just ended up enjoying my time so much. And it had been a long time since a book had done that. And there is something about the prose and the way that Gaiman writes as well that I find particularly inspiring. And should I ever go back to trying to write fantasy again in future, I would love to be able to bring my humour into it as well. Because for so many years I was afraid that humour meant poor writing. But indeed, you need all those different beats to create a really great story. You need the moments of humour and the moments of light to combat against the moments of dark in there, and I never thought of that before, but seeing it featured in Neil Gaiman's prose has really changed the way that I appreciate writing. Also, there are some really interesting creatures and ideas within his fantasy that just makes me wonder what's going on inside that brain of his. There's a quirkiness and an eeriness and a sort of weirdness that I really appreciate that kind of blends itself well with the urban fantasy style. Like, there's something like the Addams Family in there for me, and I really adored the Addams Family growing up, which is another reason that I'm actually really fond of Jess Kidd's writing. And she's become a favourite writer of mine because there's this gothicness and this weirdness and this quirkiness to the writing, well, to the tale, that just speaks to my soul, really. I really like the darkly humorous stuff. And Jess Kidd, because we're moving on now. Neil Gaiman's a favourite, so is Jess Kidd. We're moving on to Jess Kidd, whose darkness still has this touch of humour to the tale. And so they're really, really dark tales. Like, the first one I read was The Hoarder, which has gone on to be my least favourite book of hers, but they're all fantastic, and if I did star ratings, would be 5 stars. The Hoarder has this tale of a woman who's sent to kind of help this man out, but then she can see saints as well, and there's this touch of the supernatural there that I kind of appreciate with Joanne Harris that Jess Kidd does, but there's a different type of humour there. Then I went to Things in Jars, which is this detective story where people have been going missing and there's a possible Frankenstein's monster type deal going on. Go back to the first book, which is himself, and I've just remembered I forgot to renew my library books. But himself is this man whose mother was murdered and he's going back to the village he came from for answers. But at the same time, Jess Kidd has managed to blend this humour there. They feel so incredibly real and vivid, the books do. The landscape is captured as well, and I don't know how she does it. You know, when you're looking at someone's craft and you're wishing that you could have that craft as well, and you're trying to figure out just how it's done, and there's no hope in hell of ever knowing how the author managed it. That's how I feel with Jess Kidd. I don't know how she writes such unbelievable things, makes me believe them, and makes me thoroughly adore them. I don't own any of her books because I've always had to get them out of the library, but I really wish I did own them because they are some of my favourites, and I really look forward to revisiting them in future because I felt so comfortable within the worlds. It's just amazing to think about. And she's only released 3 books, and yet 3 books is all I needed for her to prove a favourite of mine. Sorry, I'm just thinking of the works now. Another writer I want to move on to, if we're talking about fantasy and weirdness, is Susan Dennard. Here we have Something Strange and Deadly. I first discovered this writer many years ago from a blog called Let the Words Flow, which also featured Sarah J Maas and another writer, Kat Zhang, and Savannah J Foley. I don't know what the other writers are doing anymore because my heart kind of went to Susan Dennard after the release of this book. This is a YA novel that was released in 2012, set in Philadelphia, an alternative Philadelphia where zombies are. What I really appreciated, again, and I liked it about Robin Hobb, and I like it about Susan Dennard, is she's not afraid to torture her characters. And if you ever follow her writing journey and what she works at, you know that this is someone who's really focused on improving their craft with each book. This probably very quickly became one of my favourite YA series because of the fact that Susan Dennard didn't mind torturing her characters in order to tell the story. She allowed bad things to happen to the characters because they're living in a world in which zombies have come to life. Not everything is going to be roses all of the time. I appreciated the characters that were there. It was strange because it was a historical novel and a steampunk novel, and those were things that I hadn't really liked in the past, but somehow Dennard really made me like them. The prose in these books, again, was probably very much like the YA stuff that I was seeing at the time, and I don't think that that's a problem at all. I think it's just a styling thing. Moving on, we have the Truthwitch books, and I think that they might be my favourite from her. I know that there were certain issues I had with the books at the start in terms of the way that they were written, but over time Dennard's craft has really worked out well, so that now there's a really heavy focus on the story and making it very character-based. It's fast-paced and it explores female friendships really well, and I think that as Dennard has realised how she can craft the world to enhance it and make it the best it is, it's a journey that I'm really excited to follow and to see how Dennard manages to progress as a writer. Whilst Truthwitch does have a lot of tropes that I'd noticed in Robin Hobb and does follow the storylines, she's now seeming to veer off so it doesn't seem so close to what I've read previously, and she really seems to be coming into her own, and I love to see it. Here I'd like to move on to Akwaeke Emezi, who is another writer who I think has improved with each book, and that improvement and progression is something that I really like to see. So this is Freshwater, and this was released in 2018 and follows a person whose body is inhabited by many spirits and discusses gender and trans identity and gender non-conforming, and I remember being somewhat confused by this book. I didn't know that I was going to read anything else by the writer. Moving on, I read Pet earlier this year, which is a middle grade novel following a trans child who accidentally releases a model from her mother's artwork. This monster comes to life and tells her that there is evil lurking in a town in which evil shouldn't be able to live. Moving on from there, what I found a really impressive, fantastic middle grade book, we've got The Death of Vivek Oji, which I read last month and has just left me with all of these thoughts and conflicts in my head that I'm really grateful to the author for putting into prose and helping me recognise. And with each book, there is this sense of spirituality, familyness and community that I really appreciate. And when getting shown alternative things to what we've been taught are like the stereotypical nuclear family, and Emezi is pushing against that and showing that there are many different types of family, there are many different types of community, and we should appreciate them more and uphold them in our fiction so that we aren't showing the same generic view. And I adore that. Really do actually like the way that Emezi writes. Seeing it improve and seeing the different characters and the way that the enhancement of Emezi's characters is coming along, I really do look forward to reading anything they release in future, because they've proved quite remarkable in how quickly their writing has advanced and their craft has got better. And honestly, as well as loving to see it, I really do look forward to seeing anything they produce in future. Nicole Dennis Ben is the final writer on my list. Here we have Here Comes the Sun, which was released about 4 years ago. I read Patsy earlier this year, and that was a vast improvement on this book. Each time I have read the author's works, I have been impressed by the tone. There is a certain detachment from there, but I love her descriptions, I love her characters, and I love her stories. I love discovering communities that I didn't previously know about. They are discussions of womanhood that I don't think we ever put at the forefront of literature. In Here Comes the Sun, we have Viola, who is constantly trying to protect her sister by taking on a job that she doesn't necessarily want, but is paying well. She's also hiding her sexuality, which is a theme that comes up in Patsy too. Patsy sees a mother go to live with her female lover, and she leaves her daughter in, I can't remember what country it is now, I'm very sorry about that, to go to New York. When she gets there, she discovers that her lover actually has a husband and a family, and the lifestyle she thought she was going to lead isn't going to happen. My brother's back and he's howling at the dog. These stories are written with care, if that makes sense. When I say care, I mean it in a way that everything, every word feels like it was chosen for the purpose of being there to tell the story. It feels considered, and these aren't books that are fast to get through. They're very slow-paced and slow-moving and can be somewhat like wading through treacle. And I have to be in a certain mood to read that sort of book. I don't mind being a bit slow and meandering in order to get the overall shape of a story. And even though Nicole Dennis Ben has only released 2 books, I have this feeling that her writing could go the same way as Joanne Harris or any of these other writers, and be really impactful for me and be something I revisit and I adore and I want to support. Both of her books have ended up impacting me. There are images in the stories that have stuck in my mind. The characters constantly come back, and I've used examples of stuff going on in these books in discussions that I've had with people about things going on in the world. And I think that if they've lingered with me for that long, like here we have a book that was released 4 years ago. Yeah, this book was released 4 years ago, and I've read it once and things still linger from this book. Patsy is the same. And yeah, I am wholeheartedly thrilled by the idea of Nicole Dennis Ben releasing more books into the world and getting to consume them, because there is a mastery of craft there. So they are all the writers that are currently my favourites. My favourite writers in 2020, my top 10 are now listed here. And yes, this is changing all the time, but every single one of these writers, if someone's looking for a certain type of book, I will go to something by one of these writers. And I am constantly thrilled at the prospect of any of these writers releasing new books. These are like authors for me now. So now that everyone's home, I best go and say hello to them. So I want you to let me know, what are some of your favourite writers writing today? If you've read any of these writers, do you agree? Do you disagree? Feel free to reach out in the comments and open up the discussion. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.